is my pleasure to introduce Professor Marbella from Columbia University, Department of Chemical Engineering. Professor Marbella has a PhD from the Millstone Group at the University of Pittsburgh. She then went across the Atlantic for her postdoc at the University of Cambridge, where she had the Darwin Research Fellowship, and she was a Marie Curie postdoc fellow. She is currently an assistant professor at Columbia University, and she has many awards and honors, including the Charles Hatchett Award in 2019 and the NSF Career last year in 2021. So with that, we'll get started.
All right, thank you, Ariel, for the very nice introduction. And I'm happy to be here to tell you about some of the work that my group has been doing for the past few years at Columbia. So the talk that I'm going to give to you today is focused on lithium metal batteries. We're interested in lithium metal because they can provide much higher energy density than graphite anodes that were used in current lithium ion batteries. And a lot of the work that I'm going to show you today is focused on characterizing and understanding this solid electrolyte interface, or this SEI layer, that deposits on the surface of our lithium metal. And we're thinking about an electrode that's as reactive as lithium metal. This SEI layer is going to form as soon as we put our lithium metal in contact with any type of environment, whether it be the environment of our glove box or whenever we dunk it into our liquid electrolyte or put it in contact with our solid electrolyte. So the SEI layer is comprised of a variety of electrolyte decomposition products as shown here. So these are two models from the literature. This is our mosaic model, and this is a multi-layer model that we have. This layer will continue to grow and evolve over the course of cycling, and it impacts our battery capacity. It impacts our plating behavior, which I'll talk about today. But it's intimately related to things like performance and safety overall device. So there's been a lot of research effort focused on understanding and characterizing the chemical composition of this SEI layer on the surface of lithium metal. And we have lots of different techniques at our disposal to be able to do this. One of the most common and accessible techniques that we can use is X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, which is shown here. We can get very detailed chemical analysis of the composition that we have deposited on the surface of our lithium metal. We can also use techniques like X-ray absorption spectroscopy or TOF-SIMS, which can often be coupled with our XPS to understand the lateral arrangement of our SEI on the surface of our metal electrodes or any electrodes in general. And then we can also use things like cryo-EM to understand both the lateral and the radial arrangement of our SEI, the different components in our SEI on the surface of lithium metal. So this is extremely sensitive to characterizing different crystalline components in the SEI itself. So I would really sort of split these into ultra high vacuum techniques. And then we have other techniques like spectroscopies that are going to also be able to give us very detailed molecular level information on what's on the surface of our electrodes as well. These are going to have a little bit better resolution for some of the organic decomposition products because we can get much more detailed information in something like an FTIR or a carbon-13 NMR. So you have better chemical resolution in some of these techniques compared to something like an XPS spectra, where you're really limited by the Z of the element that you're looking at. So light elements, you don't have as good of chemical resolution. So my group does a lot of NMR spectroscopy. And we really love NMR spectroscopy because we really think that it can help answer not only compositional questions about this SEI layer, but additional questions that we have about the interface that go beyond just understanding the composition here. So when we do some of these bulk measurements, we basically just get a readout of, what's the overall composition. What we would ideally also like to be able to do with that compositional information is understand how these individual compounds are actually arranged on the surface of our electrode. This will tell us something about how lithium ion flux to the electrode surface works. In addition, we also ideally would like to know something about ion dynamics. So how does lithium ion transport to the surface of our electrode actually work? So this is your electrolyte solution out here. Whenever you're plating lithium metal, for example, you have to move lithium ions from the electrolyte solution through this SEI layer and then eventually to this electrode surface where you have your charge transfer event and you can actually plate your zero valent lithium metal. Then, of course, we would also like to get some information on how these SEI layers are actually forming in the first place. And this is, all three of these areas are places where we think that NMR could play a very special role. So if we're interested in learning about the arrangement of our SEI, we can exploit this dipolar interaction in our NMR spectrum, which has some distance dependence. So we can learn something about the arrangement of individual compounds by using our NMR as a sort of spectroscopic roller. So we can actually do very detailed measurements on the distance between individual spectroscopically distinct compounds within the SEI layer itself. If we're interested in ion dynamics, we can use different NMR techniques like diffusion measurements or relaxation measurements to actually probe ion dynamics at these interfaces or within this SEI layer itself. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of those measurements today. And then if we're interested in SEI formation, we can start to measure some of these reduction reactions in situ. So just like we can go and get an MRI and we're still living and breathing whenever we go and get that MRI, we can also cycle our battery while we're doing the NMR experiment and monitor what's happening inside. Just like if we were sick, if our battery is sick and it's suffering from some side reaction that we don't want to happen, if it's occurring at a great enough quantity, we can hopefully detect this with NMR spectroscopy as well. In addition, we can also start to perform some imaging experiments that I'll talk to you about today, where we can learn about what's actually decomposing at these interfaces by performing an MRI itself and see, what are the different compounds that are actually at the lithium metal electrolyte interface, how do these vary spatially, and learn about how things are deposited in the Z direction here. So my group does a lot of work on lithium metal. We also do some work on composite cathode. I gave a talk on this work yesterday in the materials science seminar. And then we also do a little bit of work on potassium ion batteries, trying to understand if all of these things that we're learning about interface chemistry and lithium systems can also pertain to other alkali metals. The short answer is it seems like no. A lot of the things that we know and love from lithium ion are not going to translate quite as well to potassium ion batteries. But I won't have time to talk about that today, but interesting principles on their own. So I'm going to focus on two stories for lithium metal, one in liquid electrolytes and one in solid electrolytes. In both of these systems, we're interested in the different parameters that can control our lithium deposition behavior. So especially for our liquid electrolyte systems, it's extremely well known that simply by changing our electrolyte formulation, we can get dramatically different types of lithium deposition morphologies. So we can go from plating these very high surface area structures that are associated with low Coulombic efficiencies in the formation of dead lithium or lithium that is not electrically connected to our underlying electrode anymore, so they don't actually participate in electrochemistry in this cell. So this is why we have low Coulombic efficiency. And if we just swap out our electrolyte, we can move to these sort of bud-like or column-like morphologies that exhibit more reversible lithium plating and stripping behavior. So these are very low surface area deposits compared to these high surface area deposits. And this is simply due to a swap in our electrolyte formulation, which tells us that it's very likely due to a change in something that's happening in our SEI layer because we're changing our electrolyte formulation. And so it's likely something in this interface layer that I've colored blue and purple here. So in the project that I'm going to tell you about today, we're focused on these ether-based electrolytes paired with lithium metal anodes. The two ether solvents that I'm going to focus on are this DOL, the cyclic molecule, and DME, this linear molecule. We like the ethers because they're very stable at low potential. So whenever we place them against lithium metal, in comparison to the carbonates, which are used in commercial lithium ion batteries, which are not stable at low potential, we would expect these to decompose or be reduced at the lithium metal surface and have a lot of solvent decomposition products that deposit on the surface of our lithium metal. What this allows us to do is solely focus on salt decomposition instead of solvent decomposition. And we can see this very clearly just by analyzing the solution NMR in our ether-based electrolytes versus our carbonate-based electrolytes. If we cycle these cells and we just take out some of our spent electrolytes in the carbonate solvents, we see all kinds of electrolyte breakdown products that are dissolved in the electrolytes. But if we do this in the ether system, we essentially see no solvent breakdown products. So what we do in this experiment is we have this DOL DME as our solvent system. And we look at two different salt systems. So here on the top, we have 1 molar lithium TFSI. And on the bottom, we are just swapping out half of our anions. So half TFSI, half nitrate. And you can see from these SEM images that are collected after galvanostatic plating that we get very different plating morphologies simply by changing out half the TFSI anions for nitrate anions. So here we have these very high surface area lithium deposits. After 100 cycles, we also have a very low Coulombic efficiency of 45%. Whenever we have our nitrate present in our electrolyte solution, we see this transition to these low surface area lithium deposits that are seen in SEM. And we also have a transition to these much higher Coulombic efficiencies after 100 cycles of 97%. So we really wanted to understand, what is going on at the interface to cause these dramatic changes in lithium plating behavior. So in order to start investigating what's going on here, we do the easiest experiment possible for us, which is just collect a lithium-7 NMR. So what we're looking at here is the lithium metal peak that comes from our underlying substrate. And then we have a peak that shows up here around 0 ppm. This is all of the different components that are in our SEI layer. And you'll remember from the first slide that our SEI has all different types of lithium containing compounds in it, right? So things like lithium fluoride, lithium oxide, and so on. The issue with lithium-7 NMR is that for all of these solid ion conductors, we don't have very good signal resolution here. So they all overlap with one another in this region. So to actually be able to resolve chemically what we have here, we have to play around with our magnetization a little bit in the experiment. So what we do here to see what is actually hidden underneath this peak is we polarize our protons and we pass that magnetization to our lithium atoms in our sample. Whenever we do this, only the lithium atoms that are near an organic phase should light up. And that's this green peak that we see here. We do the same thing with our fluorines. So we polarize our fluorines and then we transfer that magnetization to our lithium atoms. And we see this yellow peak light up here. This peak coincides exactly with where we would expect lithium fluoride to show up at -1 ppm. But if we look at the yellow and the green spectrum, we see that this still doesn't account for all of our peak volume under this SEI. We're still missing this region that's now highlighted in blue. And we started to think this is probably coming from our native oxide that's present on the surface of all lithium metal chips. So in order to figure out what was going on here, we couldn't transfer magnetization from oxygen to lithium. The NMR active oxygen nucleus just isn't abundant enough to do that experiment. So what we did was we measured the spectrum of bulk lithium oxide, and we saw that it coincided almost exactly with this peak shown here at 2.9 ppm. So we ascribed the remaining peak volume here to lithium oxide, which makes sense Even if we scrape off the oxide layer of our lithium chip, it grows back almost immediately, even at our levels. So now that we have a basic understanding of what's underneath this SEI peak, we want to get some dynamical information on how lithium ions are moving through this interfacial layer. In order to do that, we perform an experiment called exchange spectroscopy NMR, or an XC experiment. So this experiment is performed under equilibrium conditions. So just to be clear, there's no applied potential here. This is just solid state diffusion under equilibrium conditions. And what I'm showing here in this cartoon is that equilibrium site exchange between two spectroscopically resolved sites. So we can run this experiment in either two-dimensional or one-dimensional mode. Two-dimensional mode just takes longer, but it gives us more chemical information and tells us what is exchanging with what. The model that I've shown here, we saw in our previous slide that the lithium metal and the SEI, these are well resolved for one another. So in principle, we should be able to see exchange between these two sites. So if we collect a 2D spectrum, this is what we would expect it to look like, where we see along this diagonal, a peak for lithium metal, a peak for our SEI, which would be this big blob that contains all those individual components. Then if we have exchange between our SEI and our underlying metal electrode, we would end up getting these off-diagonal cross peaks. And the volume of these cross peaks is related to the rate of the chemical exchange across that interface. Of course, collecting this two-dimensional spectrum, although it tells us what is exchanging with what, it takes a long time to run. So we also run these experiments in one-dimensional mode so that we can extract quantitative information on these exchange rate constants. So I'm just showing you how the experiment works here. So all we're doing in this experiment is we are incrementing this mixing time and collecting our NMR signal. As we increase this mixing time, we expect to see an NMR signal decay. This NMR signal decay can be fit to a function that accounts for the inherent relaxation properties of this exchange process, but also the chemical exchange, where we pull out the K value that describes the exchange. This is what the data looks like from this one-dimensional experiment. So like I told you, on the y-axis, we have our normalized NMR signal intensity. On the x-axis, we're incrementing our mixing time. And what I'm showing you here is the decay that we get for our metal peak, the decay that we get for our SEI peak. And you can tell just looking at these two qualitatively, when we compare our TFSI only electrolyte to our electrolyte containing TFSI and nitrate, you see that these SEI peaks, they're decaying at different rates. So this tells us that we have different exchange rates across this interface between lithium metal and our SEI. Of course, we can fit these functions and actually extract those quantitative values. Whenever we do that, we see that we have about an order of magnitude faster exchange for our sample that contains the nitrate additive compared to the TFSI. We think this is due to the fact that the SEI formed in the case of the nitrate has higher ionic conductivity and facilitates this faster exchange across that interface. And this is why we're getting these smoother deposits in that case. But of course, we also want to know a little bit more about the architecture that's forming in these systems as well. We ran this in one-dimensional mode, so we lost all this very rich chemical information. So we want to go back and do some two-dimensional analyses. So this is what an example two-dimensional spectrum looks like. So this is our experimental data. Here we have our peak for lithium metal along the diagonal, our peak for our SEI, which is this big blob. And then here, I'm showing the cross peaks that represent exchange. There's also some directionality to these cross peaks. So this cross peak here represents movement of lithium ions from our SEI to our lithium metal. And this cross peak represents movement of ions from our lithium metal to our SEI. And we can pull out a slice here to see exactly what's going on during this exchange event. And whenever we do that, we see that if we take a look at this peak, it's centered directly over this region that we've assigned to lithium oxide, so this blue line here. Again, this makes sense to us when we start to think about it. Even though we scrub off our oxide layer, as soon as we scrub it off, it basically grows back immediately. So the thing in the SEI that's modulating this exchange event is our native oxide that's present on the surface of our SEI. So the way that we sort of think about this is the very first layer on our SEI is our native oxide. Then whatever is decomposing in the electrolyte is deposited on top of this. So that's what we're looking at here. We can also, if we take a look at this big blob that we have for the SEI, we can also dig a little bit deeper into this blob and look at exchange between the individual compounds that we have in the SEI layer itself, and try to get a feel for, how are things moving through this SEI layer, this very complex layer here. So on this top row here, what you're looking at is individual slices from that big SEI blob. And this is the TFSI only sample. And what we see is that we get, pretty even peaks for all of the individual components that we have for the SEI. This tells us that we have relatively even exchange for all of the different compounds that we have there. The way that we would get those exchange pathways is if we had this mosaic-like structure where things are just randomly tiled and arrayed, and then exchange would just happen randomly throughout this mosaic pathway. If we take a look at the nitrate-containing sample, we actually don't see, especially if we focus on these two panels, which represent our slice for our lithium fluoride and our slice for our lithium ions near our organic phase, we actually don't see exchange with our native oxide layer. So this tells us that there's something there blocking exchange with the native oxide and lithium fluoride, for example. The only thing different about this sample is that we've added in this lithium nitrate. So what we think is happening, or what we hypothesized at the time, was that this nitrate was being preferentially reduced on top of the native oxide and blocking this exchange event. So in order to figure out what was happening, we didn't feel as though we had good enough resolution in our lithium 7 NMR to actually interrogate this. So we performed some depth profiling in the XPS to see if this is what was actually happening. So if we focus on this panel on the right, we're looking at the depth profile XPS for our nitrate containing sample. And what we see here, if we focus on the nitrogen region, is that we don't really have any nitrogen containing reduction products on the very top surface of our SEI layer. But as we start to sputter down into our SEI, we do indeed start to see these nitrate containing reduction products. So what we think the SEI actually looks like in this case is that we have this oxide overlayer on our lithium metal chip, but because this nitrate preferentially reduces, we have these nitrate reduction products directly over top of our oxide layer. Then over top of that, we have all the other reduction products that form during electrochemical cycling into this mosaic-like structure. This was interesting to us because it also matched some of the cryo-EM data that was recently published by Shirley Mang's group, looking at lithium metal in contact with lepton, which is known to produce smooth lithium deposits as well. And here she sees that closest to the lithium metal surface, you also get this lithium oxide rich layer, which is capped with this lithium nitrate rich layer. And then they have other lepton reduction products closer to the electrolyte. So we have this very similar architecture. Both are correlated with good lithium deposition, good cycling performance. So we thought that this multi-layer structure was actually correlated with these smooth deposits, having these high ionic conductivity compounds that facilitate fast exchange at the interface was also critical to achieving these morphologies that we see in SEM. I think the one big takeaway is, when we do these experiments now, instead of thinking about our electrolyte decomposing on the surface of lithium metal, we're always trying to think about the fact that we have this native oxide on top of it. And it's this native oxide that our electrolyte is interacting with rather than the lithium metal itself. And that's probably changing some of the reduction pathways and how we think about them. The reason that we think we get better deposition behavior whenever we have the nitrate there, we think it's because we're making this transition from a mosaic-like architecture in our SEI to this more multi-layer structure in our SEI. When we have this multi-layer structure, even if we didn't have good ionic conductivity, what we do have is good lithium ion or uniform lithium ion flux through each individual layer. So we actually see more decomposition if we quantify how much decomposition products are on the surface. They're more heterogeneous, so we see more different things on the surface. But the fact that they are arranged this way allows the lithium ions to reach the metal surface in a very uniform way, allows even current distribution, that allows us to get these very smooth deposits. Okay, so that encapsulates some of the work that we've done on liquid electrolytes. And now I would like to transition to some of the work that we have done on solid electrolytes. Solid electrolytes, these are very interesting because they present their own very unique challenges when thinking about lithium metal and all of the unique challenges that that brings in and of itself. So with lithium metal and a solid electrolyte, you have a lot of the same issues. So you can still have lithium filament formation. In this case, we're going to think about lithium filament formation growing through grain boundaries in the solid electrolyte or cracks in the solid electrolyte. Also, in this case, you have two solids that are butted up against one another. So you want to think about how we can achieve good interfacial contact between those two solids. So we're often thinking about, what kind of stack pressures do we have to use here? Or how do we get these two systems to wet each other? So if your stack pressure is not high enough, you can often have void formation at the interface during the stripping event of lithium metal that has some detrimental effects that I'll talk about in a little bit. So there's a lot of mechanical issues that come into play in these systems, but we can also continue to think about some of the chemical issues that will also be relevant here. So we may have lithium filament formation because same idea, we have these sort of current hotspots that are forming. If we don't have uniform flux to our surface, this can cause a filament to shoot off in between a grain boundary. But another reason that we might have a filament shoot off is the fact that we have some type of electron conductor forming at these grain boundaries as well that can nucleate a lithium filament that can grow across this separator and cause a short circuit in these systems as well. So there's both chemical and mechanical reasons that we might have failure in these systems. Okay, so because we have both chemical and mechanical changes in these systems that we're interested in, we were very interested to try to be able to study these things at the same time. That's a very hard ask. That's a very difficult thing to do. Most of these things have been studied post-mortem in these systems. So there's been some very beautiful work, just trying to understand the fact that lithium filament growth does occur via grain boundaries in this system, but it's all been done ex situ. And the interfaces in these systems, they are buried. So they're traditionally much more difficult to probe than a liquid solid or a gas solid interface. So NMR is exceptionally good at probing chemical changes, not so great at probing mechanical changes, but my colleague Dan Steingard, he uses operando acoustic measurements to try to measure mechanical changes at the interfaces in these systems. So the acoustic signal, if you have something like a void forming in these systems, it will immediately give you a readout because you've gone from having a solid-solid interface to a solid gas interface. This causes a huge drop in your acoustic signal if you're constantly monitoring during battery operation. So very easy to read out some of these mechanical changes in the system. Again, both of these can be done in a non-destructive fashion, so we don't actually have to perturb the system in any way in order to get this information out. All of the data that I'm going to show you for this project, like I said, this was done in collaboration. The acoustics was done with Dan Steingard's group. All of the materials that we looked at were made by Jeff Sakamoto's group, specifically by his graduate student, Mike Wang, who is now a postdoc here. But this was really only possible because we had great and robust materials to actually be able to study. So just to orient you so we can actually understand the NMR data that we're going to look at, I want to talk to you a little bit about something called the bulk magnetic susceptibility effect. So in addition to the chemical changes that we can see just looking at our NMR shifts, so we looked a lot at these individual lithium shifts that we had in a battery. We can also get individual shifts in our lithium spectrum that are due to the direction that something is growing. So this is demonstrated here. So if you just place a strip of lithium metal into the magnet and you place it in perpendicular to your magnetic field, you end up getting a shift of 244 ppm. If you start to rotate this strip, this shift starts to change and it goes to higher frequencies. So you start to see if you tilt 45 degrees to the external field, then you're at 254 ppm. If you go all the way parallel with the external field, so this is 0 degrees now, your shift changes all the way to 272 ppm. So this is a change of about 30 ppm. So that's pretty great resolution just to a change in direction from going like this to this. This is very powerful when you're thinking about something like lithium filament growth, where you have your two electrodes oriented this way, you have lithium filament growth, it's going to start pointing this way. You actually have lithium metal oriented two different directions with respect to your external magnetic field, if you have taken care to put your battery into the magnetic field, knowing which orientation your metal electrodes are with respect to the external field. We can also do other fancy things in this experiment, like take an image. So all of the experiments that I'm going to show you today are something called chemical shift images, where what we're looking at on the x-axis is just a normal lithium-7 NMR, where you can see this bulk magnetic susceptibility effect. So we can cover this all up, and this is just a normal lithium NMR that we would get if we put this battery into the magnet. The way this battery is oriented is the same as I'm showing in this picture here, where our electrodes are oriented perpendicular to our external field. We start plating. So when we start to grow this microstructure on our plating electrode, the microstructure is oriented parallel to our external field. So we can definitively assign this peak to our lithium metal electrodes. We can assign this peak to our lithium microstructure. And then on the y-axis, what I'm showing is an MRI that's taken along the Z direction. Okay, so on the bottom here, we have our stripping electrode. On the top here, we have our plating electrode that's basically all turned into this lithium microstructure. So we have a lot of surface roughening that's basically oriented all of our lithium in the vertical direction here. So this is what we can expect our chemical shift imaging data to look like. This is just showing the region of the spectrum where our lithium metal shows up. So remember, it shows up around 250 ppm. All of our interphase and electrolyte information shows up near 0 ppm. We can also take images of that as well. Okay, so what we wanted to look at in this study is, how do these interfacial mechanics and chemistries change as a function of stack pressure? So I'm going to start out showing you this data piecewise. So what we're doing in this experiment is we turn on our current and then we just start plating. This is in a lithium LLZL lithium symmetrical cell. So here we're turning on our current. You can see our voltage profile here. We start turning on our current, everything is normal. But as soon as we turn on our current at a low stack pressure of 2 megapascal, we immediately see a drop in our acoustic signal. This tells us that we have void formation at this stack pressure. So we have some solid gas formation at that interface. So we plate. We have this spike in our voltage. We let the cell rest. Then we plate again until we get another spike in our voltage profile. And then we let the system rest. We collect MRI during this time as well. This is the MRI at the end of plating. We actually had so much void formation in this experiment that our stripping electrode completely fell off. So we had those voids form at the stripping interface where we would expect. And whenever we take this MRI here, what we see is that we have this peak that corresponds to our bulk lithium. So this is from our electrode. And then we have a bunch of lithium microstructures that have gathered at our plating interface. This is exactly what we'd expect because we have these huge spikes in our voltage profile. Basically, we've just plated a bunch of microstructures at low stack pressure. What we're looking at on the right-hand side here is just the peak in the image that we get for our LLZO electrolyte. We'll also have interphase information here, but you can see that the LLZO spans the entire body of the battery. So we don't have a top electrode here because it fell off of the system. We also take electrochemical impedance spectra as at the different points of cycling here. So the different points that are shown in the dotted line. So initially, whenever we assemble the cell, our impedance is very low. After this first plating step, when we first let our cell rest, we see that our impedance has jumped up very high to about 3,000. We let the cell rest for about 25 hours and it's relaxed back down to about 500. Then we plate again, we see our voltage spike and we measure our impedance again. It's gone all the way up to 6,000 at this point. So we aren't able to get good agreement here. We've basically seen that we've had a large change in our interfacial chemistry, probably due to these voids or other chemical changes at the interface. So we wanted to see, what's really going on in the SEI here. So this is a MRI image of the electrolyte region that I'm showing here. So sampling up. So what we see here is that this peak corresponds to LLZO. But then at the interface, we have this large additional shoulder at much higher frequency. And this is very unusual. So this higher frequency, this is way out of the range where we would expect normal lithium ion conductors to show up. It's actually heading towards where we would expect electronic conductors to show up. So I told you in the previous project, we actually had such a hard time distinguishing all of the different ion conductors that were present in our SEI layer because they all overlap with one another. And now we're getting good resolution. The only reason we get good resolution is likely because these phases have unpaired electrons in them. They're good electron conductors. They're shifting to higher frequency. The higher frequencies that we have over here are in the direction of lithium metal. So we know lithium metal is a great electron conductor simply due to the fact that it's a metal. And this is consistent with a lot of the intercalation compounds that form in other battery materials. So basically what we think is happening here is that, these large changes or these high impedance values are correlated with the fact that we're forming these electron conductors at our interface at low stack pressure. So we wanted to figure out a way, could we prevent the formation of these electron conductors? Were we able to lower these impedance values simply by increasing our stack pressure? So we did the same experiment and just increased the stack pressure to about 7 megapascals. We can see changes immediately in our acoustic experiment, where as soon as we turn on the current, we no longer see this drop in our signal that would indicate we have void formation. Instead, we see our acoustic signal rise. This is likely due to lithium creep instead of void formation. So basically, at this current density that we're using, so these are at 0.2 milliamps, we're no longer forming voids. They're able to be filled in by lithium creep itself at 7 megapascal. Of course, we still really push the system and make sure we get these spikes in our voltage profile, but you can see that the time axis here is very different. So we're plating lots and lots of lithium during this step since we're at the higher stack pressure. When we take a look at our MRI data, again, just because we plated so much lithium here, we do indeed see what appears to be a short circuit in our MRI. So we see that our two lithium electrodes are actually connected to one another, but we don't see the same, like they've maintained good interfacial contact. They haven't actually delaminated from the LLZO electrolyte, but we have formed some microstructures and likely a lithium filament that's connecting the two and is likely responsible for this spike in our voltage profile. When we take a look at our impedance data, we see something very similar at the beginning of cell assembly, which is expected, but we actually see much better recovery between our two plating steps. So they're almost in perfect agreement between our first and second plating step, which indicates that we likely have much better interfacial contact, but we've likely also formed a much better chemical interface as well. And whenever we take a look at what's going on chemically at this interface with our chemical shift imaging experiment, that's exactly what we see here. So we don't actually see any species at this higher frequency near 20 ppm. We only see things that correspond to LLZO and LLZO decomposition products that are solid ion conductors. So things that would not be quite as detrimental to the interface. So what we think is going on here is that whenever you have this void formation at low stack pressure, this leads to an increase in your cell overpotential. And whenever you have these higher overpotentials, these often lead to side reactions that we think are producing these electronically conductive species in our interface. So this was very interesting to us because this void formation from a mechanical standpoint is often thought to be reversible. You know, you form these voids at low stack pressure. All you have to do is squeeze the system, let some lithium creep happen. You can get rid of these high interfacial resistances, and then you can continue to cycle the cell normally. But I think what this data shows is that, you know, there might be chemical changes that are not as reversible as some of these mechanical deformations at the interface. So basically I say here, you know, maybe there's a chemical reason for higher stack pressure. We push these cells pretty hard, but there might be certain things like the formation of electron conductors at the interface, and their formation may not be as reversible as these voids. Something else to think about in terms of how to actually make these solid state cells commercially viable. So with that, I would just like to thank the people who did the work, our collaborators on these projects. So we collaborated with Keith Fritching, who is now a senior scientist at Sandia, Jeff Sakamoto's group at Michigan, Dan Steingard, who is also at Columbia. The funding sources for this, my PhD student, Richard, performed most of these studies on lithium metal, but also my whole group, and I would be happy to take any questions. Yes.
So I have two questions. So it was a great talk. They're both in the first part. One is more technical and one is more conceptual. So can you go to slide 18? So maybe I'm just not quite understanding this. So my understanding here is what the data is telling you is that when you have the lithium nitrate present, you get the deposition of these nitrogen-containing products. But if you look at the data on the left in the LiTFSI, it looks like you're actually getting those same products also depositing. Am I interpreting that correctly? Or
yeah, so I didn't go that in depth with this. So these are at different shifts. So I have them marked here, and these are actually different products. And you can see this is a different shift here. That's a slightly higher binding energy. So the TFSI also has a nitrogen group in it. So that's what we're seeing on the surface here is residual TFSI salt, even though we wash our samples. I think this is TFSI fragments in the SEI because we see a lot more TFSI fragmentation. And I didn't have time to get into that, but for some reason, the nitrate also inhibits TFSI fragmentation in this case. But if we analyze the spent electrolyte in both of these scenarios, the 1 molar TFSI has tons of TFSI fragmentation where this one does not. So that's what I think is going on there. Yeah.
So the basic take home for all this is essentially that you're reducing the number of interfaces of the solid electric interface by having this nitrate present, so therefore you have a cleaner, sort of less resistive conduction.
Yes.
But I guess the conceptual question I have then is, let's say instead of these small molecule liquids, have a solid polymer as your electrolyte. How does that affect the diffusion of those nitrate species? How does that affect the formation of the SEI? Does it change anything about the chemistry to have an immobile solid polymer phase as opposed to a mobile liquid phase?
So in the solid polymer phase, are we thinking about the solid polymer phase as that basically replacing your SEI layer?
Just conceptually, if you could do that, let's say, it was
Yeah.
EO or something else like that, and you've doped it with lithium nitrate and LiTFSI, would that change anything about the chemical dynamics of the deposition of the SEI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it would have a lot to do with the thermodynamics of movement through that phase. So, or at least the way that I think about things moving through a lot of these solid electrolytes is the more disorder, the better, which is sometimes counterintuitive, but I think when you want to have lithium ion hopping through these phases, there's a lower penalty if you're going from like one high entropy state to another high entropy state. So yeah, I think the polymer might be good in the sense that you remove a lot of these grain boundaries, but bad in the sense that most polymers are low ionic conductivity.
Yeah, I guess a related follow-up question to that is, are you able to study much about sort of the reorganization that might be occurring at the SEI to sort of flatten out and get rid of any bumps that might be forming?
That's such a great question. We have not looked at that at all. And I think that's something that's, yeah, you would have to monitor how it evolves cycle to cycle, I think, to see how these things are changing.
Is it something you could do with NMR, or would you have to use a real space imaging technique?
In principle, you might be able to do some of these NMR experiments that are taking advantage of your dipolar coupling to see how it's changing. But I think you would want to complement it with some type of imaging where you could actually see morphology of it as well, because I think that's what you're getting at, like seeing the undulations in the surface, because that's going to be important too. Yeah.
Is that another area where maybe switching to a solid polymer phase might help protect these things, so when you actually pull it out and section it for cryovan, you don't get instant rearrangement?
Possibly, yes. Yeah. Although I think, yeah, I think the way to move forward is going to be trying to do as many measurements in situ as possible. So, because I think a lot of these things change so much as soon as you take them out of their native operating environment. And I mean, we do a lot of ex situ work as well, but I think it's something that we're constantly thinking about is how can we compare this to something that's more akin to what's going on inside of the battery.
There aren't any other questions. Thank you for fantastic attendance on Zoom, and let's thank Professor Marbella.